Welcome to the battlefield, where mockery turned to silence, where German laughter vanished beneath the mud of the Somme. What began as arrogance ended in disbelief. What they once called the soft doughboys would soon break the line they thought unbreakable. July 1918. Near the Somme, northern France. The air smells of rain and smoke, engines cough, bayonets glint in the half-light. Trenches twist through the fields like veins, and every breath carries the weight of waiting. Machine gun nests hum low in the mist, unseen but listening. Somewhere an order will come and everything will change. Before we begin, leave a comment with where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening. Share what you feel in this moment, the pulse before the storm, the hum before history starts to move. Engines hot. The air trembles like a living thing. Steel teeth grind in the dark, waiting for the order. Somewhere past the ridgeline, the Germans are laughing. They call them the Doughboys, soft, slow, untested. But the laughter doesn't last long. Smoke fills the trench. One breath tastes like burnt cordite, wet mud, and blood iron. A sergeant checks his wristwatch, 2 minutes to 0 hour. Mud seeps through the boots. The ground quivers and every man feels the pulse of the earth, the same pulse that will bury them. Hold the line, someone whispers. A whistle cuts through the fog, shrill, final, unmerciful. They climb. Rifle bolts snap open, grenades kiss palms, machine guns begin their sermon. The Somme eats sound, swallows words, leaves only the rhythm of shells. By sunrise, the sky looks carved by fire. The Germans mock no more. Their trenches are silent bodies pressed into the same mud they once claimed would hold forever. In that silence, amid the smoke and churned clay, the myth of the American soldier begins. Not in speeches, not in medals, but here, in the cold breath before dawn, where orders turned to noise and men turned to something else. This is the Germans mocked the doughboys, then vanished in the mud of the Somme. The story begins long before that whistle cut the fog before mud, and fire swallowed the laughter. It starts in the quiet fields of America, in camps that smelled of oil, sweat, and uncertainty. The young men who would one day storm the Somme had never seen Europe, never known the cold stare of an enemy trench. They came from farms, from mills, from towns whose names no map of France would ever know. They called them doughboys. No one could agree where the name came from, maybe from the clay dust that clung to their uniforms during drills, maybe from the flower-white insignia painted on their gear. But the word carried a sneer, soft, untested, almost comic, until they began to move. By late 1917, the United States had thrown its weight into a war already bled dry. France and Britain had been fighting for 3 years, their lines frozen, their ranks shattered. Germany believed the newcomers would take months, maybe years, to matter. They were wrong. In training camps stretching from Kansas to New Jersey, American officers studied the failures of Verdun and Passchendaele. They copied nothing, they built something new. Smaller units, faster movement, sharper coordination between infantry and artillery. Every drill was a lesson written in mud and error until rhythm became instinct. Reports from the time speak of endless repetition. Men ran obstacle courses until their lungs burned, practiced rifle fire in rain, and darkness memorized hand signals for when the noise drowned all speech. They learned to live in the mud, to see it not as filth, but as cover. The modern army was learning to crawl before it could strike. Then came the journey across the Atlantic. Convoys of gray ships cut through submarine waters, escorted by destroyers that fired at shadows. Each man carried his rifle, his letters from home, and an idea of heroism that would soon change. When they landed at Saint-Nazaire and Brest, the smell of rot and cordite told them the truth. Europe was dying in layers of smoke. By spring 1918, the German High Command launched its last gamble, the Kaiserschlacht, the spring offensive. They pushed toward Paris with terrifying speed. Villages disappeared overnight. Bridges collapsed under retreating troops. Artillery maps became obsolete within hours. British and French lines broke, and the doughboys were thrown in to plug the gaps. They believed the enemy was stronger, and in many ways he was. German divisions had fought since 1914. Their officers knew every inch of the Somme's ravaged ground. But they had one fatal weakness: exhaustion. Their logistics strained their rations thin, their morale frayed by years of static slaughter. The Americans, by contrast, were unspent. Their supply trains ran clean. Their uniforms were dry. Their rifles, Springfield and Enfield, gleamed with factory oil. They carried with them not experience but momentum. And in war, sometimes momentum is enough to flip the map. Letters from officers that summer. Note a strange confidence, not arrogance but purpose. Captain Paul Green wrote, "We march as if we can outwalk the shells. The land may hate us, but it cannot stop us." Another entry unsigned found in a mud-stained notebook near Cantigny read, "The French call us reckless." Maybe, but we came to finish what started before we were born. When they reached the Somme, the ground was still scarred from 1916. Craters filled with rainwater dead trees stood like burnt candles, and every step echoed with the ghosts of 2 years earlier, when British lines had broken under their own artillery. Now, new faces stood in the same pits, carrying the same fear, breathing the same gas-laced air. At headquarters, a few German officers still laughed. They called the newcomers the boys from the candy country. They believed the first assault would crumble, that green Americans would turn back at the first real barrage. But timing and fatigue conspired against them. Behind the American advanced logistics ran like clockwork. Rail lines had been rebuilt, fuel arrived by the tonne, and every 5 miles a new telegraph line snapped to life. And with that came coordination artillery that answered within minutes, supplies that reached before collapse. By July, the pattern had changed. Reports from captured prisoners spoke of confusion. They move faster than expected. Their guns never stop. Their officers do not wait for orders. In the chaos of war, rhythm is victory, and the Doughboys were learning its beat. The Somme would soon prove it, a place already soaked in myth, already written in loss. Now it would host the moment the world stopped laughing, when the word doughboy ceased to be a joke and became a legend. The engines were warming the trenches alive with whispers, and beyond the fog, the sound of mockery still lingered, about to be drowned beneath a storm of mud and iron. Before the mud and thunder of the Somme, there was the monotony of learning, the endless grind of drills that seemed to repeat without reason. For every man who would face the front there had been months of mistakes behind him. Small humiliations measured in blisters, misfires, and sleepless nights. The American Expeditionary Forces were still new, still stitching themselves together out of fragments. Farmers turned riflemen, factory hands turned gunners, college boys turned officers. Failure was not a scandal here. It was a syllabus. In Camp Funston, Kansas, the wind carried dust so thick that soldiers joked they were eating the continent before they even left it. They drilled for 14 hours a day, trench digging in frozen ground, testing bayonet charges against burlap dummies soaked in mud. Early reports called them chaotic, undisciplined, laughing too much. But that laughter faded. Within 6 weeks, accident rates dropped by half. The first 100-mile marches hardened the softest recruits. The men learned to move as one, to read each other's silences. By the time Pershing inspected the divisions bound for France, the drills no longer looked like practice, they looked like memory. They learned the science of modern war, the geometry of fire. Machine guns were mapped by quadrant mortars, by elevation, and wind rifles by line of sight and recoil drift. Instructors insisted on precision to the inch, not the instinct of the hunt, but the mathematics of destruction. A single platoon's mistake could cost an entire company its flank. To correct that, they were forced to repeat operations until their muscles overrode fear. If the average unit lost 15 men per thousand to training accidents in 1917, by the next spring, that number had dropped to fewer than 6. Discipline bought in sweat would save blood later. Every morning began before dawn. At 0500, the bugle split the cold and lines formed in the dim gray of mess tents. Breakfast, black coffee, oatmeal, hard bread, then immediate march to the fields. The rhythm of command became a kind of music, forward, down, up, fire. Repeat. The officers barked cadence until even the wind seemed to answer. A corporal once wrote home, "We are learning to kill by heart, the rest is patience." Technology reshaped them. Trucks replaced horses. Signals became wires and sparks instead of flags. Engineers introduced the M1917 machine gun, water-cooled and brutally efficient, its firing rate over 450 rounds per minute. Mechanics memorized its anatomy: barrel jacket, recoil, spring feed block, until they could dismantle and reassemble it blindfolded. Each man was required to know not only his weapon, but the man beside him. Trust was drilled as ruthlessly as aim. "You never fight alone," instructors warned. "You are one piece of the line. If you break, all break." Fuel became the unseen lifeline. In France, the AEF consumed nearly 150,000 gallons a day to move trucks, tanks, ambulances, and mobile kitchens. At any given hour, more than 800 supply vehicles crawled across the mud toward forward camps. Each gallon mattered, each delay meant cold rations or stalled artillery. The Americans turned logistics into ritual. Rail officers were told to measure not in miles, but in hours. A delay of 10 minutes was an error, an hour was a failure. From the rear echelon to the front, efficiency was its own weapon. By early summer of 1918, the system began to hum. Training camps in France, Neufchâteau, Gondrecourt, Chaumont, filled with the rhythm of drills and detonations. Officers tested their men with simulated assaults, full-scale trench networks modeled on German lines. Sometimes the exercises turned lethal live rounds, mistimed grenades thrown too close. But even those mistakes had purpose. "Better one death in rehearsal," Pershing said, "than 50 in ignorance." Instructors from the French and British armies were astonished by the Americans' energy. They lacked finesse, but made up for it in sheer repetition. Where European veterans conserved movement, the Doughboys attacked drills with raw force. They carried 60-pound packs through knee-deep mud for miles, firing blanks, shouting, falling, rising again. The goal was not elegance, it was endurance. And endurance in the Somme would be the difference between panic and advance. By July, the divisions designated for the front, the 1st, 2nd, and 26th, could coordinate assaults with artillery ranging 5 miles ahead of their line. The average marching speed of an American column reached 4 miles per hour, faster than the exhausted French battalions they replaced. A single company could dig 200 yards of trench per night, lay wire and camouflage its guns before dawn. What had once been chaos now moved like machinery. Letters from officers described a quiet transformation. "They no longer flinch at shells," one wrote. "They joke through drills. When we rest, they sleep on mud like it's feather down." The French press, once skeptical, began to print cautious praise. "They arrive as students, they move as soldiers." Even German intelligence noticed. Intercepted messages noted a new discipline: they do not stop for bombardment. Still beneath the rhythm, fear lingered. Every man knew that preparation was only theory until the first bullet. They studied maps of the Somme, the broken villages, Péronne, Hamel, Montdidier, where ghosts from earlier battles still lay beneath the soil. Officers walked the lines with notebooks, sketching positions, calculating where their men might die. The soldiers learned to measure courage not by loudness, but by silence. When they finally received the order to move, the camps emptied with surgical precision. Supply trains rolled east, endless columns of steel and dust. In the quiet that followed the fields lay scarred and still footprints already filling with rain. Somewhere ahead, the Germans were waiting, certain that these newcomers would break. But the Americans had built something that did not bend, a rhythm born of failure, a discipline carved by repetition, a trust that had survived exhaustion. They were not the same men who had left home. The laughter of training camps was gone. What replaced it was a quiet focus, not on glory, but on survival. The mockery they once heard from afar no longer mattered. They had learned what machines learn: to move, to endure, to strike when ordered. And now, as engines warmed and the Somme rose in the distance, the Doughboys prepared to turn all that practice into proof. Dawn broke under a low ceiling of smoke and dust, the kind that never lifts. The Somme did not wake so much as shift, a dull groan from beneath the mud, a ripple through shell craters still holding rainwater and fragments of sky. From the American line, the view ahead was ruin. The ridgeline had been torn open by years of bombardment. Trees stood black and leafless, their trunks stripped like bone. Between them ran a maze of ditches and wire pools of gas-colored water, and the faint glint of helmets across no man's land. The order came just after 0530. Forward section by section, hold the interval. The first wave rose, boots sinking to the ankle in mud that swallowed the sound of every step. The only rhythm came from the distant pounding of their own artillery, a clock that no longer kept time but measured survival. Within minutes, the German machine guns found their range. Bullets hissed low, stitching the air, striking helmets and shovels with the hollow ping of fate. Men dropped without sound. Others crawled forward, bayonets raised like compass needles. In the first hour, progress was measured in yards, not miles. Reports logged by field officers recorded advance rates between 90 and 120 yards every 10 minutes when they moved at all. But the line held. Unlike the chaos of earlier Allied offensives, the Americans moved with practiced rhythm, advance, halt, fire, dig. Behind them, signalmen worked frantically to lay wire across open ground, stringing telephone cables that snapped and hissed under shell fire. Each line represented connection, command, coordination, survival. Radio calls crackled through the static, coded and clipped. Fox 3 adjust bearing 2 degrees west. Negative response from red line, assume gap. Copy. Advancing regardless. They spoke in half sentences because time had lost its grammar. The operators' hands shook, their voices steady only from repetition. Every message meant lives. Every delay meant loss. By 0700, German artillery began to answer. The horizon erupted in arcs of orange and gray shells screaming through low clouds, the kind of sound that leaves no silence afterward. Whole sections vanished into dirt and smoke. One platoon company, E-26th Infantry, recorded 72 men at dawn and 33 by mid-morning. Casualty rate 45% in 4 hours. Yet the survivors kept moving, guided by fragments of orders, by instinct, by the need not to fail. At the center, a lieutenant named Harris carried the company radio on his back, 70 pounds of wire, battery, and hope. When his antenna was hit, he kept shouting coordinates into the receiver until it burned his hand. He would later write, "The air smelled like iron and rain. We were blind, but we kept talking." Those words, scratched in a notebook found weeks later, became the only record of that transmission. Terrain dictated everything. The Somme was not ground. It was a memory made solid. Every shell crater was a tomb, every ridge a blind corner. The Germans had rebuilt their defenses on old British trenches, labyrinths of wood and clay reinforced by steel plates scavenged from wrecked tanks. Their machine guns nested deep, firing through narrow slots invisible from a distance. To reach them, the Americans had to crawl, cut wire by hand, throw grenades into holes they couldn't see. But the training had taken root. They moved in pairs, one firing, one advancing. When a section went down, another filled the gap without command. The discipline of months began to show. They did not stop a captured German, later told his interrogators. Even when our guns broke them, they reformed, like water. By mid-morning, the advance had reached the first German trench line near Meote. It was not victory, just contact. The defenders had laid tripwires, mines, and gas shells set to burst when disturbed. The Americans had masks, but the rubber stank and stuck to sweat. Breathing felt like drowning. Some tore them off, coughing until they collapsed. Others learned to count breaths, inhale 4, exhale 3, keeping rhythm as if it could defy the panic. At 0930, a new sound rolled in engines. Light tanks from the British 4th Brigade lumbering forward at barely 4 miles an hour, their tracks grinding through mud that clung like glue. For the first time, the Doughboys fought alongside machines. The tanks drew fire, soaked up bullets, crushed wire. In their shadow, infantry surged. Coordination was messy. One tank veered off course, another sank halfway to its turret, but the momentum shifted. An American corporal later recalled, "The ground began to move with us. That's when I stopped thinking about the Germans. It was just the mud and us." By noon, they had advanced nearly a mile, won 600 yards, the farthest Allied gain on that sector in months. It wasn't planned. It was persistence that made the map move. Still, the cost mounted. Field medics reported over 300 wounded by midday, many left behind, as stretcher teams bogged down in craters. Ammunition runners collapsed from exhaustion, carrying belts of cartridges through knee-deep water. The sound of rifles blended into a single, unbroken hum, a metallic chant over the landscape. Officers no longer shouted. They gestured, drew lines in the dirt with knives. Communication shrank to what could be seen, not said. By late afternoon, the Germans began to fall back. It wasn't retreat so much as erosion. Their counter-barrages grew irregular, their fire less concentrated. Reports captured from a field desk later revealed the cause: shortage of shells, disrupted supply, at Roye reinforcements delayed. Logistics, once invisible, now decided the rhythm of death. Where the German lines thinned, Americans slipped through small groups, uncoordinated but relentless. Aerial observers reported the scene from above, scattered dots of khaki moving across gray earth, slow but steady. The line looked broken, but it was breathing. Pershing's staff back at headquarters received the first coded update. Somme position gained moderate resistance, holding ground. The words sounded clinical, stripped of the human noise beneath them. As night began to fall, the battlefield dimmed into something almost peaceful. The shell fire slowed. Rain started again, light at first, then heavier, until it washed blood into the craters. The surviving men crouched in the newly won trench water rising around their boots, steam rising from their rifles. Some cleaned their weapons by instinct. Others just stared at the dark horizon, unsure if they had won or merely survived. They had lost nearly a third of their strength in a single day, but the line had not broken. For the Germans, the shock was not defeat, it was disbelief. They had expected panic, retreat, confusion. Instead, they faced men who did not seem to understand the meaning of retreat. They were new, one German corporal wrote, but they fought as if the earth itself pushed them forward. Behind them, the radios still crackled, carrying voices through static, clipped, exhausted, but alive. Blue line secured. Repeat. Blue line secured. No one cheered. The rain swallowed the words before they reached the next trench. In the silence that followed, the myth deepened. The Doughboys had crossed the Somme not as veterans, but as proof that resolve can learn faster than fear. And somewhere beneath the mud, the echo of German laughter, the same that had opened the story, was gone, buried under a mile of endurance and rain. The second day began without a sunrise, just light bleeding through ash. The Somme was no longer a battlefield, but a breathing wound. Steam rose from the craters, rain turned to mist, and every step sank into someone's yesterday. The Doughboys held their thin line through the night, waiting for a counterattack that never came. But the silence was worse. It meant the enemy was preparing something else. At 0430, scouts reported movement in the fog. Shadows crawling along the ridge to the north, the faint grind of wheels and iron. Within minutes, the first shells fell short, striking their own abandoned positions. Then came the real barrage. The sky turned white, air became pressure, and earth turned fluid. Shrapnel ripped through sandbags, splintered rifles tore apart the wire that had taken days to lay. Radio cables snapped like veins. Command went dark. Lieutenant Harris, the same who had carried the field radio the day before, crawled through the mud, dragging what remained of the transmitter. The logbook in his pocket, later recovered, noted 3 words. Line dead. Moving. He found shelter in a half-collapsed trench, jury-rigged the antenna using a bayonet and the frame of a ration tin, and tapped out one last signal. Enemy advancing, hold line, no retreat. After that, nothing. The German push was fierce, sudden, coordinated stormtroopers with flamethrowers and grenades moving fast between shell holes, their faces wrapped in gas cloth. They were laughing again, short, cruel bursts as they closed in. For a moment it looked like the line would collapse. Whole platoons went silent. The mud filled with steam and smoke. Then came the decision, split-second impossible. Sergeant Alan Cooper, 24 years old, son of a machinist from Ohio, was manning a Lewis gun whose barrel had jammed with mud. Around him, half his section was gone. The Germans were within 50 yards. There was no time to clear the jam, no time to think. Cooper stood, tore open the cooling jacket, and poured the last of his canteen into the smoking chamber. The hiss was deafening. He reloaded by hand, fired single bursts until the gun seized again, then switched to his sidearm. That moment, reckless, futile, defiant, broke the advance just long enough for reinforcements to arrive from the flank. When they found him later, he was still holding the trigger. The water had boiled away. The metal fused to his hand. His face was turned toward the ridge as if waiting for the laughter to start again. In the confusion, Corporal Dunn recovered the fallen radio. The log still warm from the battery, the copper wire glowing faintly in the dark. He scribbled a single entry on the back of a ration label Cooper held. Ridge stable. Losses high. The note was passed down the trench by hand, no call signs, no code, just the words themselves. By 0900, the Germans had stalled. Their assault met by coordinated fire from machine guns that had been re-aimed manually when the rangefinders broke. American artillery, working blind, began to answer, using preset coordinates. One shell out of every 5 landed short, but the rest struck true. The ground shook with a rhythm that was half chaos, half intention. The cost was severe. In less than 6 hours, casualty reports listed over 900 men wounded or missing in the 2nd Division alone. The loss rate, 30% in a single morning, was unsustainable, yet the line did not break. In the eyes of history, this was a small engagement. In the eyes of those who lived it, it was the universe. In one crater near the forward line, Private James Ellery wrote to his sister on a scrap of map paper. The letter, later recovered and preserved in the National Archives, reads, "If you ever see a newspaper say, 'We pushed them back,' remember it wasn't courage. It was noise, smoke, and not wanting to be the first to stop." He signed it simply, J. The ink was blurred by rain. He never posted it. By midday, the fog lifted just enough for air observers to spot the German fallback. It wasn't orderly men retreating in clusters, some carrying wounded, others crawling. The Somme once again had turned on them. The same mud that had swallowed British and French divisions now held their boots like chains. For every step backward, they lost 2. Machine gun fire chased them into the fields they had claimed hours before. One German report later admitted, "Enemy does not yield. Their coordination exceeds expectation. Their morale impossible to break." The words sounded almost like disbelief. The mockery that had once filled the air, soft Americans, untested boys, had vanished. In its place, silence. The same silence that had closed the first day returned heavier, now stitched with the names of the dead. At headquarters, Pershing received the after-action summary. The telegraph message read, "Somme line intact, heavy losses, enemy repelled. No details, no names, just the math of endurance." But in the margin of that report, an officer had written 3 words in pencil. They did not flinch. That night, rain fell harder. Medics moved through the trenches, collecting bodies and letters, sorting the living from the nearly so. Among the debris, they found Harris's burned logbook. The last page, half melted, still legible. Silence after contact, men steady, Germans fading. It was dated July 10th, 1918. There was no signature. When dawn came again, the ridge was empty. The enemy had pulled back under cover of darkness, leaving behind shell casings, field stoves, and the unmistakable imprint of boots prints that led nowhere. For the first time, the Americans held ground at the Somme without assistance. What began as survival had turned into control. And somewhere in the distance between the thunder and the smoke, the echo of that old laughter still lingered, faint, hollow, unclaimed. But now it belonged to no one. The Doughboys had buried it in the mud along with the myth of their weakness. When the guns finally fell silent, it wasn't peace that followed, just the absence of direction. The Somme looked less like victory than exhaustion given form. The ground steamed under the sun, carrying the scent of oil blood and burned powder. Every crater had a story, every trench a grave. The men who had survived moved through the wreckage without words, counting faces that would not answer roll call. The numbers came slowly trickling in through damaged lines. Of the American divisions engaged, over 2,000 casualties in 48 hours, roughly 1 in every 4 men. The dead were buried in shallow pits, their names written on scraps of canvas or carved into rifle stocks. What remained above the soil was machinery, broken tanks, splintered trucks, the skeletons of communication lines stretching like nerves across the mud. Repair crews arrived before the medics were finished. They worked mechanically, salvaging usable wire, reassembling field radios with trembling hands. Engineers drained trenches, rebuilt firing platforms, patched the rail spurs that carried ammunition to the front. It was methodical, not sentimental. One corporal wrote home, "We fix before we mourn." That was the new rhythm of modern war repair, as survival as routine. Luck had played its part. So had weather and timing. But skill learned, drilled, beaten into reflex had made endurance possible. In the command dugouts, reports read like ledgers. 1 mile advanced, 3 positions held, enemy withdrawn. Each line clean, detached, almost polite. No mention of the faces that went missing between coordinates. Yet behind those reports, officers argued quietly about what had actually won the day. Some credited logistics, the precision of supply lines that never stopped running, even under fire. Others pointed to leadership Pershing's insistence on autonomy, his refusal to let American units dissolve into Allied command. And some said it was something simpler, the refusal to believe the myth of inferiority. When the survivors gathered that evening, they didn't speak of victory. They spoke of repairs of rifles that jammed gas masks, that leaked grenades that misfired. Each complaint was also a lesson. Mechanics logged over 400 weapon malfunctions in the first assault alone. By nightfall, most were corrected, bolts filed, barrels cleaned, belts refitted. Out of that mechanical discipline emerged something more enduring than pride, a sense that survival depended not on luck, but on control. Letters home from those nights reveal an uneasy calm. "We thought courage was noise," wrote Private Ellery before his letter was forwarded by a chaplain. "But it's silence that keeps you alive." Another wrote simply, "The laughter's gone, maybe that's how we know we've done something right." The men who returned from the ridge did not march like heroes. They walked quietly, boots heavy with clay. They had seen the myth die, and with it the illusion of clean war. The German withdrawal was confirmed by aerial reconnaissance 3 days later. From above, the once contested ground looked strangely geometric, rectangles of new trenches, thin lines of movement, the faint outline of where the ridge had been retaken. Intelligence estimates placed German losses at roughly equal to the Americans, but the psychological toll was deeper. Captured diaries told of disbelief. They came from nowhere. "We fired until the barrels burned, but they kept advancing." That confusion was the true turning point. The Doughboys had not just held, they had inverted expectation. At headquarters, the staff debated the same word that would later fill the headlines: resilience. Not strategy, not genius, just the refusal to yield. One officer summarized it in his field journal. "They learned faster than they died." It was both grim and exact. Training, repetition, trust, all the invisible things had proven stronger than fear. The weeks that followed were spent not in glory, but in logistics. New lines were dug, new wire laid, the trenches renamed after towns no longer standing. Engineers mapped the ground again, updating the coordinates for the next offensive. Every repair was both preparation and memorial. The ridge, once an anonymous patch of France, was now marked on every army map, not as a victory, but as proof that the Americans could hold. For the men still stationed there, the war continued in smaller ways. Rats to kill rations, to share letters, to write and never send. Yet something intangible had changed. The laughter that once came from across the wire never returned. The Germans had vanished from that tone, replaced by a wary respect that neither side admitted, but both understood. When historians later traced the evolution of the American army, they marked this moment not for its size, but for its signal. Here, amid the mud of the Somme, the new soldier emerged not a crusader, not a novice, but a craftsman of endurance. His weapon was not bravado, but rhythm, not arrogance, but repetition. Even Pershing, known for restraint, allowed himself one line of reflection in his post-action notes. They learned the difference between movement and meaning. The words were almost poetic and perhaps unintentional, but they captured the truth. What began as training had become transformation, an education paid for in mud, iron, and silence. By the time the wounded were evacuated and the trenches rebuilt, the ridge had already settled into history. The last shell casings were collected, tagged, and shipped back to the States for display. Reporters would later visit and find nothing remarkable, just uneven ground, quiet villages, and the faint echo of stories too heavy to retell. But for those who had stood there, the Somme was not just a place, it was a threshold. The thesis of it all could fit on a single torn page. It mattered because endurance once learned does not fade. It becomes the nation's memory. When the war finally ended, the world tried to name what had happened, but words came slow, and the sound of victory felt strangely hollow. The men who had crossed the Somme did not march in triumph. They returned to ports shrouded in fog, their uniforms still carrying the smell of cordite and soil. Newspapers called them heroes. The soldiers themselves called it survival. Yet somewhere between those two truths, the modern American soldier was born. Military historians would later trace entire doctrines back to these muddy fields. The concept of combined arms infantry and artillery moving as one found its first rhythm here. Coordination through radio, the precision of supply timing, the trust between units that no longer waited for orders, these became the bones of every campaign that followed. From the Argonne to Normandy, from Korea to the desert wars of the century ahead. The same pulse-repeated train until instinct replaces fear. Move until movement itself becomes intelligence. In Pershing's post-war reports, the Somme occupied only a paragraph, a small note, in the margin of a vast, grinding conflict. But within that paragraph lived the seed of transformation. It proved that American forces could adapt faster than they were expected to fail. It showed that mockery could become discipline, and discipline could become legacy. For every historian who measured victory by land, gained, there were others who measured it by what endured rhythm-structure method. The veterans who came home carried that structure within them. Many never spoke of the war directly, but its logic shaped their lives. They became engineers, teachers, foremen, fathers, people who counted time differently after hearing a whistle in the fog. A few joined new institutions, the National Guard, the Reserve Corps, embedding lessons of coordination and readiness into the very framework of post-war America. The Somme had turned them into students of consequence. Culturally, the image of the doughboy lingered not as propaganda, but as archetype. The rounded helmet, the calm stare, the unpolished courage. It appeared in paintings, recruiting posters, and later in the silent films that tried to recreate the impossible landscape they had walked through. But the deeper legacy lived not in images, but in rhythm, the cadence of marching songs, the measured pauses in letters written decades later. The way veterans described silence as something that could be heard. Even Germany, years later, would study those same encounters, the sudden coordination, the refusal to retreat, the unpredictable blend of improvisation and order. Manuals printed in the 1920s referred to the American tempo warfare, an acknowledgement that speed and endurance had become one doctrine. What had once been laughter across the trenches turned into analysis, replication, respect. A century later, the Somme remains a scar, visible from the air, shallow lines under green fields where wheat grows over wire. Farmers still find fragments of helmets, canteens, buttons stamped with US, rusted into the soil. Each spring, the rain brings up what memory buried. And somewhere in the wind, you can still imagine the echo, the sound of engines warming the hum of orders, the silence that followed when the laughter disappeared. Why it matters now is simple. The story of the doughboys at the Somme is not about glory. It's about transformation, the proof that resilience can be learned, that ordinary men can absorb chaos and still move forward. It's a story that warns and teaches in equal measure that endurance built from truth lasts longer than any myth made of noise. So as the century turns and history repeats in new forms, different uniforms, same uncertainty, we return to these archives not to glorify the war, but to understand what it cost to become modern. The mud, the laughter, the silence, all of it still speaks. Subscribe for archival-based stories, evidence over sensationalism, because memory deserves precision and history deserves to be heard.